With leaked data sets getting larger, cooperation between news outlets is becoming standard operating procedure. As we just saw with the Panama Papers investigation, outlets that once were chasing the exclusive, the scoop, are now willing or maybe feel compelled to join forces with their competitors and to even keep a lid on juicy stories for months or longer, all in the spirit of collaboration. One organization that really honed the practice of multi-newsroom operations was WikiLeaks, when its founder and editor-in-chief, Julian Assange, decided to partner with a few news outlets on the Afghan war logs. He created a reporting model that would go on to grow larger with more and more partners. Assange has been living in the Ecuadorian embassy in London since August of 2012. He sought asylum there when prosecutors in Sweden overseeing a sexual assault investigation were calling for him to be extradited. Assange says that he fears that in Sweden he would then be at risk of being extradited to the US, where he could be tried for espionage. We went to the Ecuadorian embassy in London to sit down with Assange and discuss the Panama Papers, multi-newsroom collaborations, as well as how to handle leaked documents. But we started out by asking him about where this story began, the source, the whistleblower. What kind of person would reveal all those secrets and why?
Assuming they were an insider or they were an individual computer hacker coming from the outside, this is a technical person, or this person had help from a technical person. I think it's likely that this represents radicalization of the technical class. That's something that we've seen, for example, with Snowden. So these usually young men who are technically educated know how to extract material. But of course, they have to have the idea. And the idea is given to them by successful examples. And now there have been a range of successful examples.
But it's also to do with hardware, though, isn't it? Because back in 2010, most journalists said most news organizations wouldn't have had a clue about encryption. Back in 2013, when Snowden came out, most Guardian journalists he was dealing with, he had to school on encryption. Now, so many news outlets are providing these boxes, these, for lack of a better term, safe havens for data that 5 years ago, only organizations like yours and a few others did. That's a big change as well, isn't it?
Well, I don't believe that Süddeutsche got their material that way. However, their journalists have been educated in the technology. But it's no surprise that it was a German newspaper, because Germany is the center of technical education of journalists, and is also the center of the political radicalization of the technical class. Both of those two things combined.
The head of the ICIJ said that ICIJ, the consortium, has no plans to release the full data set. He said, we're not WikiLeaks, we're trying to show that journalism can be done responsibly.
Yeah, that's a concern. So we're very pleased about the work that SC, Süddeutsche Zeitung, did in the beginning in developing that source. We think that's really good work. The work of the source, of course, is the most impressive. And then pulling together that collaboration is also impressive work. Saying that you're going to censor and not release a lot of the material, in fact, what must be 99% of the material, that's a big problem. It's fine to have some kind of staggered release because you want to balance the supply and demand curve. But what I want to hear is that there is a path, a transparent path to publishing the vast majority of that data set. Because that's what's interesting from a legal perspective, from a historical perspective. One of the fundamental missed lessons of the WikiLeaks experience is about how to deal with scale. Okay, one part of dealing with scale is stitch together a big international collaboration, get more bodies, more eyeballs on the material. The other way to deal with scale is the scale that is inherent in the material. When you've got millions of documents, you need to make millions of documents available, citable. So it's not just a few hundred journalists, it's all the lawyers in the world. It's all the police in the world.
As someone who pretty much wrote the book on multimedia outlet collaborations, you knew that this stuff was coming. When you saw the first wave, the first 2-3 days of reporting, what stood out for you, and what did you not see that you thought you would in the reporting?
Well, we've been covering offshore sector for a long time, since 2007. In fact, WikiLeaks has used the offshore sector for protection from banking blockades, so we even had to research it for our own purposes. But in terms of the initial angling of the story, that can be a bit strange. There was clearly a conscious effort to go with the Putin bashing, North Korea bashing, sanctions bashing, etc. But for some reason, some papers, like The Guardian, thought that that was necessary.
Have we seen any other examples in the parochial reporting, media outlets from various countries doing what The Guardian appears to have done, which is point at a distant target while not paying as much attention, proportionally speaking, to a domestic target much closer to home?
Sure, that was done in Sweden with SVT, the Swedish state TV, beating up on Iceland. Iceland's a small Scandinavian neighbour, sort of viewed as quite provincial and fun to beat up on. But at the Swedish trusts were not really examined.
Am I the only one who's surprised that more than 100 news organizations can get involved with a story like this, and somehow in an industry that is famous for rumor mongering and incurable gossips, they managed to keep a lid on the whole story until it came out?
I think it is interesting. We knew, we know other people in other news organizations who knew, but who didn't say anything. I think because no one knows of the law firm concerned. It doesn't have name recognition. Then the individual details are, they're quite technical. You can't tweet this story. You can't spill the beans with just a small comment. So I think there just wasn't the market to do it. Could also be that so many news organizations were involved, so they had incentives to not report.
The other thing that strikes me about this is that we're sitting in an embassy in London that you are not free to leave. And a lot of politicians, primarily in the United States, but also elsewhere, when the leaks came out in 2010, they turned you into the embodiment of the problem. And in a way, it kind of reminds me of that Napster story, a free musical service that the music industry went after in a big way, destroyed in a court of law, and woke up the next morning and found out that Napster wasn't their problem. The technology was their problem. There is no music industry, per se, compared to what there was before today. And I'm wondering if you feel like that now would be a good time to point out that you weren't necessarily their problem. Their problem is the technology, and you can't lock that up in an embassy in West London.
Look, WikiLeaks set an example, and the example was the threat. And the example was a threat because the technology, over time, became more available to other people who could then follow the example. Looking forward as to how I think the Panama Papers will go, it's going to be very hard to get reform without a bulk publishing effort. There's just not the mass to deal with the reliance that the establishment of the UK, the United States, and in fact most countries have in the offshore sector. Now, what you have in practice at the moment is basically a two-tiered tax system, where the middle class and the working poor pay income tax, and the wealthy essentially don't pay anything. That's a question about the structure of society, and that big picture is not being engaged with in the journalism it has done. It is, oh, North Korea, oh, Russia, oh, sanctions breaking, oh, maybe someone dodging inheritance tax a little bit. But there is a big picture here as well.
Stories that we can put a face on. They like to do the stories that they can put a face on.
You know, scandals and stories you can put a face on can be good for marketing reasons, but what are you marketing in the end? What WikiLeaks does, and what I believe should have been done with this story, is that the scandals are there to market the archive, because it's the archive that has the scale that can deal with the problem.